Hello, everyone. It's my great pleasure as Provost of Trinity College to welcome all of you to the 19th Frederick Alden Warren Lecture. Hard to believe it's this many, but it's a thrill to be able to welcome Professor Alan Galey. And we will have some words, first of all, however, from our wonderful acting librarian, Kate McDonald. So Kate, over to you.
Thank you, Provost. Good afternoon. My name is Kate McDonald, the Acting Director of Graham Library. Before we begin our lecture today, I would like to first acknowledge that the land on which Trinity College and the University of Toronto operate is part of the traditional territories of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. The land covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant. We acknowledge the stewardship of this land by First Nations, the continuing presence here of Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and the harm caused by colonialism. We commit ourselves to seeking a new and honorable relationship with the First Peoples of this land. The Frederick Alden Warren Lecture was endowed by Hilary Warren Nichols in memory of her father. The Warren Lecture is intended to illuminate the role of literature and/or libraries and culture. And today, arguably, we have an expert in all of those areas. We first invited Professor Alan Galey to deliver our Warren Lecture in 2020. And due to various pandemic-related challenges, we were not able to hold this lecture until today. So we are grateful to Alan for keeping a slot in his calendar open for the last 2 years. Alan Galey is an associate professor at the Faculty of Information at the University of Toronto, as well as the director of the collaborative program in book history and print culture. His research and teaching encompass a range of intersecting topics such as the history of books and reading, textual scholarship, as well as advancing bibliographic methodologies to address the study of born digital materials. At this point, though, I think a 2-year delay is long enough, so I would like to officially welcome Professor Alan Galey to deliver the Warren Lecture today.
Thank you very much, Kate and Provost Moran. I'm honored to be giving this talk in honor of Frederick Alden Warren and would like to begin by thanking his daughter, Hilary Nichols, who made the Warren Lectures possible. And the purpose of the Warren Lectures, as Kate mentioned, is to illuminate the role of libraries, literature, and culture. And I trust those are 3 words whose meanings we all appreciate in a world where those things are under threat for so many people right now, especially, of course, the people of Ukraine as we speak today. I'd also like to thank Kate McDonald, Christopher Horgendorn, Sylvia Lassam, and John Papadopoulos for all their work and perseverance to make this talk happen as well. I'll give you a little bit of a preface before I begin the talk proper, because the circumstances that led to the deferral of the talk are in some ways part of its subject, and Kate has already alluded to that. I wanted to particularly thank John Papadopoulos for the original invitation, which was on a different topic. John was interested in an article I'd recently published on of all things, the Canadian band, the Tragically Hip, and understanding the music of a band like the Tragically Hip from the perspectives of archival studies and bibliographical studies as well. So I had prepared a talk that was on music and literature and their bibliographical intersections. Anyway, we had to defer it for various reasons, including the pandemic, of course, in 2020. So that's all to explain why there are textual variants, substantive textual variants in the subject of this talk. If you Googled it, you may find a completely different abstract out there for a previous version, but maybe that something existing in revised states is appropriate for a talk on books and bibliography and the history of books and libraries. So for today's talk, I thought it more appropriate to pick a topic that is closer to books and libraries. Partly that's because I'm coming to the end of my 5-year term as director of the Book History and Print Culture program, the collaborative graduate program in book history and print culture here at the University of Toronto. That's also, I picked this topic also because the BHPC program, as we call it for short, had its 20th anniversary in 2020. And unfortunately, it had to happen, that anniversary, without much fanfare because we were so occupied at the time with the program's present and future, which were very much in question as the pandemic descended upon us here in North America. So I had to make decisions about what to keep doing and what to cancel as director, of course, with advice and support from wonderful colleagues in the program and beyond that. On the bright side, in the BHPC program in those years, we were able to focus our efforts on actually teaching book history to students. And we actually did have new cohorts of BHPC students in 2020 and 2021, and slightly smaller cohorts than normal, but only slightly smaller. And I have to say, they are some of the best students I've taught in my nearly 15 years of being with the BHPC program. So I am grateful beyond words to those students that they decided to study book history with us under such uncertain circumstances. So I've drawn the materials for today's talk from 4 different sources. One of those sources is my own ongoing research into born digital books and texts, which I will come to toward the end. That research includes a source for this talk that is perhaps a bit unusual. I'm curious if anybody else had a similar experience. I'm drawing partly on a draft of a preface to the book that I've been working on, which I wrote in 2020, all in one sitting. It's a bit maybe of a strange way to write a preface or any part of a book. But I wrote that preface on a single day, really just sitting down in the evening of March 25th, 2020. And that was after coming home from a walk with my wife here in our neighborhood in the Christie Pitts neighborhood in Toronto. And I would identify that day as the day that the reality of the developing COVID-19 pandemic really became clear as an event that was going to change my world and would change the way that I thought about the future. Of course, that was a process, not a single point, but that day I remember. Maybe you have a day you remember too. Anyway, the book I'm working on is tentatively titled The Veil of Code, Studies in Born Digital Bibliography, and it is largely about preserving and, more importantly, understanding digital texts of all sorts, from ebooks to video games, and understanding them as cultural artifacts. And specifically as digital artifacts that don't just exist in the eternal present of media hype cycles, but also have a pastness and futurity to them, just as the more familiar bookish artifacts in libraries and archives do and should. So I came home from that walk on March 25th, 2020, and cranked out several pages on how this novel coronavirus had reframed that particular research project, at least based on what I could see from the perspective of those early days in 2020. Anyway, I put that draft in a file folder and didn't look at it again for, well, really just almost exactly 2 years. I only looked at it again a couple of weeks ago, so it's actually become a bit of a time capsule for my own response to the pandemic. I wonder if others have had that experience with social media posts or other things that they may have written at the time. Anyway, another source for this talk I wanted to mention at the outset is conversations that I've been having over the last couple of weeks with my colleagues, the other instructors in the book history and print culture program who taught BHPC's core courses between 2020 and 2022, namely my colleagues Claire Battersill, Adam Hammond, Misha Teramura, and David Fernandez, all of whom generously took time to sit down and talk with me about what they've learned from their experiences of teaching book history since 2020. I should also acknowledge another valued colleague, Heather McNeil, who also taught in the BHPC program during those years, one of our PhD seminars, but with whom I didn't speak only because she's an associate dean and it's April, and April is the cruelest month for administrators. So I didn't want to bother Heather, but I do hope to talk with her soon if you're watching, Heather. So this talk may seem different from past Warren lectures, but that's because things are different. And these are some of the reasons and where I'm drawing material for this talk. That story about the time capsule preface from March 2020 might also explain my choice of images for this talk's poster, which is a wood engraving by the great underappreciated but very, very talented Canadian artist named Lawrence Hyde. I almost said Lauren Harris, who was one of his influences. Let me put that on the screen. And I'll begin the talk proper. Okay. So this image of a Titanic lightning bolt might be a little bit on the nose, but perhaps it captures some of how the past 2 years have felt at times, certainly the past few months as well in the world. And I have to say, though, my favorite part of this image is that tree. And I don't want to characterize that tree, but it's there, how we interpret its presence. There's more than one way to do it. Anyway, I'll be coming back to trees later in this talk. Before I start in earnest here, a couple of practical notes. Some of my slides might seem a little oddly laid out, but that's because I'm aware that some of you may be watching on screens that are placing my head over top of the slides. So I've tried to keep the upper right corner of most of the slides free. But if my head gets in the way of something important, my apologies in advance. Also, if I mention a reference in passing, like Lawrence Hyde and his illustrations from Macbeth, you're seeing one of them here for an edition of Macbeth that never actually got published, but for which Lawrence Hyde did some amazing art. When I mention references like that, don't worry about writing those down if you're interested. Within the next couple of days after this talk, I will be posting a bibliography and citations to my blog, valeofcode.wordpress.com. I'm also going to be including links to the University of Toronto's library catalog entries for some of the items that I'm showing, especially for items that are held in our rare book libraries and special collections. And that's in the spirit of those libraries and archives being open again, and they're open for visitors. So hopefully you can consider each of these images, at least the ones from the University of Toronto libraries, as an invitation and not just an image on the screen. So this is a talk in 3 parts, and I'm going to begin by unpacking the term bibliographic disturbance from my title. And that idea serves as an organizing metaphor for the talk as a whole, perhaps along with that little tree down there. The term bibliographic disturbance is one that I'm taking from the work of the late David Greedham, who passed away early in 2020, but whose influence on bibliography and textual scholarship and scholarly editing will last for a long time to come. In brief, a bibliographical disturbance is an irregularity in a book that signals some kind of disruption in the process of textual transmission or in the manufacture of the book. In his essay, Slips and Errors in Textual Criticism, Greedham uses this idea to connect bibliographical theory and psychoanalytic theory, perhaps an unlikely pairing, but that's the mode in which David Greedham so often worked and so brilliantly worked. Anyway, I'm not going to pursue that connection to psychoanalysis here, but I am fascinated by the term bibliographic disturbance, and specifically its ability to serve as both a resonant metaphor and a practical analytical tool at the same time. Here's an example of a bibliographical disturbance in a book that I learned about from P.J. Carefoot at the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library, a wonderful, one of the best teachers of book history I've ever known, who recently retired, so he's very missed. Anyway, PJ introduced me to this book, which is an English manuscript book from about 1200, which I've written about elsewhere. I won't spend too much time on this, but this is a book made of parchment, not paper, of course, given its date. And as you may know, parchment and vellum, even after these surfaces have been scraped, stretched, and prepared for writing, tends to show whether it faced the inside or the outside of the animal that supplied it. Scholars of medieval books still refer to the flesh side and the hair side of leaves in a book. Generally, the hair side is darker and shows the pores of the sheep, calf, or goat from which it came. Makers of medieval books often took this difference into account when arranging the order of the leaves so as to avoid the visual dissonance that would result from hair and flesh side passages facing each other. According to something called the Rule of Gregory, named after its discoverer, the biblical textual scholar Caspar René Gregory, normally an opening is either flesh side or hair side entirely. In other words, you're not supposed to see normally what you're seeing here, which is hair side and flesh side in the same opening. So the rare departures from that pattern of normality, like what we see here, usually indicate some form of bibliographical disturbance, such as an excised leaf that happens somewhere in that book's past. Stretching the concept of bibliographical disturbance just a bit more beyond what David Greedham tended to use it to mean, we might also consider readers as participants in the process of making a book, especially early modern hand press books, which were often understood at the time to be unfinished even after their printing and binding, if they were bound at all. Here's an example. Here we can see readers' marks in a 1497 Venetian edition of Dante's Commedia. This is a book that's part of the Trinity Library Special Collections, which Kate McDonald selected when she very kindly gave me a tour of the collections not too long ago. Again, one of those great moments when we could go back into these spaces. So what you're seeing here is something that I would call a form of bibliographical disruption, because the reader here is a censor for, well, the reader whose marks are visible on this page, for the most part, is a censor for the Spanish Inquisition, was a censor for the Spanish Inquisition in Toledo in 1614, modifying the book to strike out offending passages while leaving others intact and readable. The censor really went to town on parts of Cristoforo Landino's commentary on Dante's poem, which surrounds Dante's verse lines on these pages. Notice the scoring of the paper to obliterate, not just to overwrite the words. I'm not a Dante scholar myself, some may be present here to whom I will defer. But if you are interested in the details, this is Canto 19 of the Inferno, and you can read more on the topic in Simon Gilson's excellent book, Reading Dante in Renaissance Italy. That's the kind of reference I'll be posting on my blog not long after the talk, so don't worry about writing that down quickly. As an aside, the bibliographical disruptions of the past inevitably call to mind the disruptions of the present. Here, for example, is a very recent CNN story from just a few days ago, which jumped out at me when I read it, at least in part because I've been thinking about that Dante book in preparing for this talk. Note that the images in this story highlight the supposedly offending passages, which apparently offend by mentioning that racism exists. Like many forms of censorship, this actually, I think, is backfiring, because it actually serves to call attention to the words and to the ideas that the censor seeks to suppress. Often when we see a censored book, we lean in. Okay, what is it that's so dangerous? However, in this comparison with the DeSantis government in Florida, I don't wish to be unfair to the Spanish Inquisition. This kind of calculated bibliographical disturbance, like the kind that we see here and perhaps in the other example, are visible exercises of power, but they are also modifications of the book, or at least this is a modification of the book, to make it usable in a certain doctrinal context. That is the Dante book we're looking at now. This is, I think, a better reminder that not all book censorship takes the form of book burning or book banning. Here, censorship becomes a disruption that leaves a material trace of this particular copy's historical context as it travels through time and the world. I'm not defending this I'm not defending censorship here by any means. What I am saying is that this kind of more nuanced censorship, this part of the book, but not that part, becomes the kind of evidence that we study in book history and in the BHBC program specifically. Notice too that the censor here has crossed out not just the text of Dante's poem, but also the paratext of Landino's commentary, which accompanied Dante's poem through many editions in the early modern period. And again, see Simon Gilson's book on that history. It's strongly recommended. It's great reading. Material acts of censorship, therefore, can reveal a censor's working theory of reading. And in this case, we have a book whose disruptions, post-printing, tell a story. They probably tell more than one. My final example of a bibliographical disruption is more forensic and deals with the printing of the first folio of William Shakespeare's plays. The first folio was published in 1623, but its printing began in 1622 with some disruptions along the way. When I say some disruptions, whole books have been written about what those two words actually stand in for. Troilus and Cressida is just one. It was a play that the makers of the folio didn't have permission to include at the beginning of the printing process, but acquired partway through. That meant that the printers of the first folio had to figure out how to include a play that wasn't part of the book's original plan. So if you look at Troilus and Cressida in an actual first folio or in a digital facsimile from a wonderful resource like the Internet Shakespeare Editions or the Folger Shakespeare Library or any of the other digitized first folios that Sarah Warner has written about so well in recent years. If you look at one of those facsimiles, you will notice that not all of the running heads in Troilus and Cressida actually have page numbers appearing on them. Here's page number where we would expect to see it. There's a page number, there's the absence of a page number where we would expect to see it. For the same reason, the folio's catalog of its contents at the beginning of the book doesn't list Troilus and Cressida, even though the play is part of the book, placed between the sections for the histories and the tragedies. Here we can see that a reader has written in the title, again using handwriting to complete a printed book. They've added Troilus and Cressida because it is there present in the book. Analytical bibliography is a subdiscipline that uses forensic methods to understand the printing process of a given book, like the folio or others that are less complicated. Almost all others are less complicated, though the exceptions are very interesting. Anyway, analytical bibliography is the subdiscipline that comprehends those complexities. And a key step in analytical bibliography is the description of the sequence of printed sheets that were folded and then cut to become gatherings of leaves. Maybe it's a little bit like sequencing the DNA of a virus, though I don't want to stretch that comparison too far. But bibliographers call this sequencing collation. And they use a formula like this to describe the physical structure of a very simple hand-pressed book. Here's the collation formula by contrast for the Shakespeare First Folio. Anyway, don't worry, I'm not going to march us through all of this complexity, but even if you don't know how to read this language of letters, numbers, and Greek symbols and other symbols, you might already be noticing the disruption of the pattern on the second line of that formula, where there are paragraph symbols instead of letters. This calls it out a little more clearly here. So this is the part of the book that describes, or this is the part of the formula that describes Troilus and Cressida as it appears in the book, the First Folio. And specifically, it describes how the sheets of paper on which that play was printed were folded and bound to become part of that book. So my point with this, building on David Greedham's points about bibliographical disturbances, is that these disturbances leave a trace, and that bibliography is a discipline that gives us tools to read and describe those traces, allowing us to understand the histories of books that their authors, publishers, and printers might not otherwise tell us. That is, sometimes we can understand. We can't always, but I think that's why Randy McLeod refers to this as listening to the voice of the book to see what it can tell you, and you often have to be quiet to listen. Anyway, this slide is as far into analytical bibliography as this talk is going to get, but it's also where we can connect the forensic understanding of bibliographical disturbances to its potential as a metaphor. So if you were looking at that collation formula and thinking of tree rings, I would say that you're not wrong. Here's an image, perhaps a partial collation, we could call it, of tree rings from a blog post from a forestry project called Landscapes in Motion. And that blog post does a wonderful job of reading the evidence of environmental histories in this tree, just as the project is reading those environmental histories in the forests of Western Canada. I particularly like this post by Sarah Nelson and Sonia Odson because they use the word disturbance to describe the material traces that pine beetles and wildfires have left on the tree as it grew. And of course, trees are living organisms and books are human artifacts, but they are both material things that register their physical, economic, and even political contexts. And by 2022, I would suggest that we can't look at things like wildfires and pine beetle infestations as anything but symptoms of climate change, and therefore as anything but political phenomena and natural phenomena. They are both those things at the same time. Anyway, there's more that we could say about intersections between environmental studies and book history. It might seem like an unlikely intersection, but there's some fascinating work being done there, and I hope to see more work in the field happening there. Anyway, for now, though, I'll end this section with a suggestion that the concept of bibliographic disturbance is also useful both as an analytical tool and as a metaphor, because it leads us to examine the undisturbed parts of books. In other words, bibliographical disturbances can call into question the idea of normal, and they can help us to see that idea of normal with different eyes. That brings us to part two on the book history program's recent experience of a bibliographical disruption in the form of the pandemic itself, and to the ways that it led me and my colleagues to reinvent and, more importantly, rethink many of our normal practices as book history teachers. So this is the part of the talk where I'm drawing especially on recent conversations with other BHBC instructors, namely David Fernandez, Misha Teramura, Adam Hammond, and Claire Battershill. So I'm going to shift into a less formal, more conversational mode for this part of the talk myself, to be consistent with that. So another image that may crystallize a moment in the pandemic anyway. Perhaps you've seen other little free libraries in your own neighborhoods that suddenly had signs like this on them. This, of course, would have been from early 2020. I took this in my neighborhood. It wasn't on that same walk, but in March 2020, but it was probably not long after. But as you can tell, this is probably from that time when we thought that the novel coronavirus was transmitted primarily through surfaces, not through aerosols. So it was an interesting sign to me, not just because it was sad that they'd closed this library, but it's also actually a reminder of one of the basic principles of book history and something that's core to our teaching, which is to think of books not just as objects, but as bearers of relationships among humans, as vectors, to use a virological word, perhaps, or an epidemiological word. Anyway, one of the central ideas that you'll encounter in the book history program as a student is that idea of books as bearers of relationships. And of course, the idea that books could transmit the virus also just put them into a new context, but not entirely new in that sense that being a bearer of relationships is part of the book and book's role in the world in many dimensions. So the next slide has a white background. So I hope this doesn't harm anybody's eyes here, but sorry for the glare. I put this on a white background because I'm going to give you a little bit of a description of the book history and print culture program, but I also wanted to do justice to the beautiful logo that was designed for the program by Stan Bevington from Coach House Books. Anyway, I'll tell you a little bit about the book history program, what it's like in normal times, though you can read more about us on our website, so I won't read the website to you. But in brief, we are a collaborative graduate program, which means that we happen in the spaces between departments and academic units at the University of Toronto. We're actually made up of 14 participating academic units, with the Faculty of Information and the Department of English as the primary supporting units who provide the instructors like me and the others. Although other units have generously provided instructors from time to time as well. And we also are supported by Massey College as our administrative home, but more importantly, as the place where we normally gather for events and classes. Again, that word normally. The book history program has been around now for 22 years and counting, and was founded by Patricia Fleming, Heather Jackson, and many other faculty members, very brave faculty members around the Millennium, as book history was also being institutionalized through journals, through societies like the Society for the History of Authorship, Reading and Publishing and its journal Book History, through national histories of the book as large-scale editing projects. Anyway, our program came out of that, but also from the awareness that we've got amazing riches at the University of Toronto in terms of our libraries and archives, and that having a program dedicated to understanding that world that they represent was worth it. And I am so glad that those people did that back then. Since then, we've become a multi-generational program because graduates of our program have begun teaching in it. And I believe that started with Greta Golick, who was a dearly missed colleague. She passed away far too soon in her life, but Greta was a brilliant book history teacher and somebody whose influence in the program is still felt and appreciated today. But anyway, we have students. We have those who have graduated and come through the program now teaching in it, which is a perspective that I've been appreciating as I've been talking to present students and also other colleagues. Anyway, you can imagine that kind of teaching that is intensely affected by the closure of libraries. So that meant that we could not be in places like this. This is one of the places where we are very, very lucky to do our teaching. This is the Mclean Hunter Room at the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library, just down the road from Trinity College Library. And this is the space where normally we teach our introductory course, which all of the book history students take, master's and PhD, called Introduction to Book History. And this is a course that Misha Teramura taught entirely remotely in fall 2020, and which David Fernandez taught mostly remotely, but he was actually able to get into at least into a space like this in 2021 a few times with the classes. But here it is sitting empty as I often imagined it when I couldn't be there myself. Although this is actually a photo from a happier time. This is from just a few weeks ago, in fact, in March, when I was getting the room ready to take my first class back into the Fisher Library to experience what we have there. Incidentally, for any rare book librarians looking closely, that's not water sitting on the table, that's hand sanitizer. Anyway, David and I actually sat down at one of these tables just yesterday and had a conversation about how it's a wonderful space. It's also a complicated space. It's not a simple space to walk into, whether as a teacher or a student or anybody else. It's a space that we very much missed during the pandemic. I really did have, I mean, I think saner people were probably, missing things like going on vacation, things like this. But I kept thinking about this space. It's one that I care about and missed. So it's much longed for. And yet I think it's fair to say both David and I and others have come back, perhaps looking at this space a bit differently than we did before. And I'll say more about that in a little bit, especially in connection with that window that you see in the background. Anyway, for 2020 and 21, the windows that we were looking through tended to be the ones on our screens. That's true of just about anybody teaching in this field or related fields at that time. Anyway, in the book history program, our instructors and our students did some really remarkable work to adapt to those circumstances. And I want to just spend a couple of moments on those adaptations before coming back to the question of what did we learn. So what you're seeing here is an example of that adaptation and creativity and dedication. And what we're seeing here are bookmaking kits that were created by Claire Battersill for her students in our winter term seminar for master's students. And that's for a course called Book History in Practice. And that's the course our master's students take in the winter term. So to make these kits, Claire purchased materials from our, sorry, this is going to be one of those talks where a pet interrupts. I've got a letter in here, sorry. Okay, after all that scratching at the door. Okay, we'll edit that out later. So these are kits that were made from materials that Claire sourced from local book art supply stores here in Toronto, and then mailed to the students so that they could work together on Zoom, making books together with materials that they had at home in their hands, on their tables, in their kitchens, or wherever they were. And many other people in the book history world were doing similar things. This very quickly turned, these kinds of kits and these sorts of steps turned into a really productive thread of discussion in talking about book history pedagogy in places like the Conference for Society for History of Authorship, Reading and Publishing, or SHARP, but many others as well. Leah Price has said that these kits have become an emergent genre of the pandemic. And I love the idea of the kit as a genre, but Shannon Mattern has also written very productively on kits. Anyway, this is also an image that shows us not only the kits that Claire created, but also the two images on the left show us objects that Claire created as feedback to the students and sent to those students as well. So the students were creating objects for their assignment, and Claire was creating objects in return as commentaries on their other objects. A very bookish way of thinking, one that takes extra effort and time and materials, but something that's also, I think, goes to the core of how the book history program has evolved over time as well. Again, thanks to Greta Golick's influence, but also Claire and many others. And that is the increased importance that we're placing on making things, not just studying books that we've received from the past, but the book arts as a living practice. And something that the making of these sorts of objects takes us beyond the diagram. And they're a reminder that the book arts are arts. It's a reminder of the importance of creativity as a path to knowledge. And anyway, these are all things that have become increasingly important, and I think they will be in book history's future, especially with the arrival of the wonderful Kit McNeil, who is the new college printer and director of educational outreach at Massey College, where the bibliography room is a place that students have been learning about the book arts using actual presses and type and other artifacts of printing and other things. Anyway, that's described a bit on the book history program website and in our social media, so I won't go on about that. It deserves its own talk. Anyway, here are some different kinds of material responses to the effects of being forced to work through screens together. These are illustrations that were created by Jojo Carlin for the book history program student colloquia in 2021 and 2022. This is from the 2022 colloquium that happened not very long ago. And when, as so many programs were doing, we had to decide what to cancel. We had to decide what we couldn't run. And again, the pandemic, in its strange way, was actually helpful in making it really clear, okay, what matters. And the answer didn't take long to arrive at, that what matters is any events that put students at the center, any events that are student focused, and especially student organized. And that's how our colloquia have always been in the book history program. So anyway, we had that on Zoom, just like this event here. And of course, that has its advantages and drawbacks. Just as for this event, there are people who wouldn't be able to attend in person, which I'm delighted that you're here. Of course, we lose the value of the informal. There's the random conversation you have with the person next to you. Can you believe that time the speaker's dog scratched on the door and interrupted? Anyway, things like that. The sociality of book history happens in the in-between spaces as much or more than in the formal spaces. Very, very difficult, perhaps just not possible to reproduce online. But the touches of the human, I think, are felt all the more when screens are the medium or principal part of the chain of mediation. So Jojo Carlin is a wonderful artist, as you can tell, and Jojo has done illustrations for other events as well. Feel free to check out her work, linked at the top there. Here we can see the notes that she took on Dominique Polanco's 2022 keynote on colonial fantasies of a 16th century Mexican manuscript, the wonderful keynote that she gave for this colloquium. And I am going to move on too quickly from this slide, but you can look at this image and the other illustrations that Jojo created on the BHPC website. If you just go to the section of the website under media and illustrations, you can see the full set of illustrations that she created, not just to document the event, but also as souvenirs, essentially. Here we have another illustration that Jojo did for one of the student panels from the 2021 colloquium. And you can, just looking at the titles, you can get a sense of the range of topics. That diversity, even that small snapshot of the diversity of topics and interests and disciplines that you can see in this one image, think of it as a synecdoche for the program as a whole. That diversity points to something very important about our program. I mean, book history as well, but especially I've come to appreciate it in being in the BHBC classrooms, which is that it's a program that puts together people in the same place who, in some ways, the modern university almost keeps apart by design, and we've somehow managed to hack it by getting people into the same space. We're not the only mechanism for doing that at U of T, but putting people with those different backgrounds together in the same space also requires that we think about common ground, even shared vocabulary, not as a kind of canonizing measure, as a solution to diversity, as though it were some sort of problem. It absolutely isn't. It's a strength, but it is something that entails work. It's a very welcome kind of work, but it is part of the arts of interdisciplinarity that I think are actually central to book history, not at its margins. So I think of my own recent experience of a book history classroom just this past term, where there will be people from literary studies, but there will be somebody from art history. There will be somebody from religion. There will be somebody from Germanic studies. This year we had somebody from music as well, which there are many more. History and philosophy of science and technology. There are it's, to me, teaching in this program is a constant reminder that book history and literary studies are closely connected, but that's not the only connection that defines book history. Anyway, that kind of diversity is one of the things that, that I like best about this program. However, we did really want to get back into physical spaces as well. So again, another image of the Fisher Rare Book Library in the room where we have many of our classes and also class visits from other courses around the university and community groups and things like that. I wanted to give you an image that had a bit of a sense of the scale coming with it. Getting back into a space like this, I have to, as I've mentioned, was a really big preoccupation for me during the pandemic. I kept thinking ahead to, okay, what will it be like to go back in here? Again, this image is from a happier time. You can tell that it's pre-pandemic because two of Fisher's own archival scholars here, Natalia Rattan and John Shoesmith, well, they're not masked. And also for those who know John, his hair is a lot shorter than it is now. But looking at this, again, you can imagine how this is a complex space as well, and definitely an intimidating space for students as well, for those who might walk into it and not feel as though it is their space or that it is there for them. Yet it very much is, but it's a process, I think, coming to feel that you can walk in and feel comfortable, feel normal, rather than feeling like you're the disruption and out of place. That takes work too, and it's important. Anyway, we were able to bring in small groups into this space in this past month. Before I get to that, though, I just wanted to interject with an important caveat about the mode in which I'm telling these stories, which is just to acknowledge that the pandemic is not over. This is not a post-pandemic story. As this report from one of Canada's finest news sources, the Beaverton, reminds us that wanting COVID to be over and it actually being over are technically two different things. Another caveat that goes along with that idea, I mean, it's definitely not over here in Toronto, but another caveat that's more about the longue durée as well is the danger of resilience narratives. The word resilience well, it was always a questionable word in some of its contexts of use. It's a word that I've deliberately avoided using in this talk, except in under question marks, as it were, or the phrase "back to normal." That's a phrase that I also have a changed relationship to. Perhaps others do as well. My sense is that we didn't go through all this merely to go back to normal. If I settle for going back to normal in some way, I don't think I've done justice to how lucky I was during the pandemic. That's not to say that the yearning for normal, that there's anything wrong with that. I feel that too, but I think you could say it's a bibliographic imperative to think about what counts as normal. And that's something that's a way that bibliography as a mode of thinking goes beyond books, even as it comes from them. Anyway, with those caveats in mind, hopefully I haven't lost any viewers who are now checking out the Beaverton, but that's okay if you are. Anyway, here we are. When we did come back, actually, this isn't the Fisher. This is our first, I think that this was our first in-person event we were able to have as a program. And this is in the Massey College Library, thanks to the organizing of Andrea Marin and especially to Emily Cook from Paper House Studio, Toronto. I've included the link to paperhousestudio.com if you'd like to check them out. And Emily came, normally we take our classes to Paper House Studio near Trinity Bellwoods Park here in Toronto and do paper making in that space with Emily, Flora, and others there. And that's because paper is one of those things that you understand very differently once you've made it. You can, again, read all the diagrams in the world. You can hear all the descriptions. You can even see videos of paper making. It's a different thing to have your arms up to your elbows in the stuff. And anyway, here, Emily very graciously came to Massey College and came to us and set up, and we had our first paper making workshop here with students from our master's students class, but also a couple of the PhD students came as well, which is great. Again, the kind of thing that there are some things, I mean, that's one of the things I appreciate about the pandemic, that it has taught me is, well, what are the things you can't simulate? You can approximate, but what are the things that are not replaceable? And I would say paper making as an experience is one of them. Another class visit here. Sorry, this is feeling like a family photo album. Maybe that's because it is to an extent. So this was the class when I was able to take my PhD seminar, Books 2000 this term, into the Fisher Library. And that was an interesting experience because, as I mentioned, I had built up the return to the Fisher so much that in my mind that I think I went a little bit overboard. Maybe my students might corroborate this. And I called up all the books. And the Fisher staff were very supportive in letting me do that, but we had a Kelmscott Chaucer on the table. We had William Caxton's 1481 Cicero, the oldest printed book in Canada, recently acquired by the Fisher Library. That was present. We had Vesalius's great work on anatomy, that and a copy that was actually annotated, we believe, in his own hand toward a third edition of his book, where you can see Vesalius leaning in, correcting details in images, because that's how science often works, through representations, but also through slow, painstaking correction and iteration. Another lesson that I took about that applies to the pandemic. We also looked at Marshall McLuhan's copies, his annotated copies of James Joyce, and we were lucky enough to have a Shakespeare First Folio present there as well. So I did go overboard. That's pretty clear. And what I learned from that is that, well, obviously how lucky we are to be able to do that, but also I think if I was to do that again, I wouldn't try to make up for lost time. Maybe there's a lesson there for book history teaching as well. That's not how teaching works. It's not about the objects, it's about the time spent with them. So one of the things about the collocation of objects that you can learn from is that I believe, always have to think about time as a factor, the temporality, not just of the objects in history, but also the temporality of experiences. That's something good teachers know. I think I've forgotten, had to relearn it again, and my students were very patient with me on that. Another visit to the Fisher, I'll spend less time on this one, but this is a class called The Future of the Book, which I teach for the Faculty of Information, and others have taught it as well in recent years. Of course, with a title like that, you're never going to teach the same way twice, nor can any one person do a definitive version of it. Anyway, for a course on the future of the book, dealing with born digital, digitized, other sorts of books, it's especially important to interact with physical books when thinking about digital ones. Here we have one of my students leaning in with a magnifying glass to read the Caxton. One of the simple, powerful, extraordinary things about that book is that you can read it if English is your only language. Not that this student is multilingual, but it is just the simple act of reading Caxton's English book is extraordinary. So being able to do that was an experience that you could do on a screen, but there are differences in doing it here, not least that we're doing it together as well. Anyway, we did my PhD seminar, we came back with fewer books and more time, more focus. Here we are looking at a set of books which was suggested by a student in the course, Jay Hughes, who I'm very grateful to Jay for that suggestion, that we look at something called the Millennium in a Box, a collection of artist books made by the Canadian Book Artists and Book Artists Guild. And this is my last slide, or second to last slide, but it was a reminder too of books as things that you learn from, not always through rigorous bibliographical analysis in the mode of that I was discussing earlier with collation formulas and those sorts of things, as important as that is, but also objects that we learn through by playing with them. And artist books are things that usually invite play, almost always challenge and frustrate and revise and perhaps illuminate our assumptions and the things that we bring to them. So of course we were reading Johanna Drucker in relation to these sorts of objects, but the objects have their own stories to tell and experiences to offer, which is what we were doing here. And I'm hoping the students go back and we'll spend more time with these things. The last slide I'll consider though for this section is, again, an important part of the Fisher Library's architecture, not just because it admits natural light, which helps, but as far as I know, I'd be curious if anybody else knows of other examples of rare book reading rooms whose windows are street level, and which are floor to ceiling, and where there is a busy urban intersection outside. This is looking outward from the window onto one of the University of Toronto's central intersections at Harvard actually where Harvard meets Hoskins and then crosses St. George. And this is, so here we have the protected space of a rare book library, and then we have the public space outside of it. This is a space where I have seen anti-abortion protesters when I've been in here teaching classes. It wasn't long ago that I was walking along that sidewalk past people protesting the vaccine mandate that my university had rightly implemented in order to keep us safe in our classrooms. This is a public space outside. I must be exposed to things I may not agree with, but that's the nature of a public space up to a point anyway. Anyway, the dialectic between those two kinds of spaces is a fascinating one, and one I'm always thinking about. It comes down to one of the things I often suggest to my students, which is, look up from the books and think about the relationship between what we do and the world outside. Anyway, that's a theme that many have been writing about in the field of book history lately. Matt Kirschenbaum, in his conclusion to his latest book, Bitstreams on the Future of Digital Literary Heritage, writes about this very, very persuasively in his conclusion. Others like Matt Cohen, Michelle Warren, Whitney Terteen, Bridget Fielder, and Jonathan Senshine in their introduction to their excellent book on book history in American literature and race. The book history has been turning increasingly as a field to the relationship between the field and the world around it. Anyway, that also brings to mind the relationship between book history and the future. And Jacques Derrida famously said in Archive Fever that archives we think they're about the past, but archives are about the future. And I would say, along with that book history and bibliography often look like disciplines that are about the past, as though entering a space like this was a retreat from the present into a past. I mean, it is sometimes, and I do that myself sometimes too. I wouldn't blame anybody who is attracted to this space for it. But I think book history as a field is increasingly addressing itself to the future and to what's outside the windows, as well as what's inside, and not as an either or. So that brings me to the final part of the talk, which I'm calling Archives and the Future. So this is a part that's drawing a little bit on some of my meditations on born digital materials and digitized and born digital materials during the pandemic, but also those objects in relation to the idea of the future. So as we know, the archive is a key topic in many parts of the humanities, not just book and media studies. Like bibliographical disturbance, the term archive is both a technical term, which has a whole scholarly literature behind it. It is also a metaphor, which has a whole other scholarly literature behind that. And sometimes those literatures communicate with each other. I would suggest they don't communicate often enough, especially the metaphorical side of the literature. I'm one of the few other people who have been trying to call attention to the work of archival studies as its own field. Beyond Derrida's Archive Fever, as important as that book is, there are journals and people, more importantly, who represent archival studies as a field, and not just archives as a profession, but those things go together. Anyway, what we're looking at here is the reading room in the archives at Trinity College, renovated not long ago. Beautiful space, but also, again, one that is there for students and others to come and experience the materials. Often when we show archives, we show stacks in the background, Hollinger boxes, row upon row of them. To me, the most important spaces are the reading rooms, because that's where the encounter with the records happens, and with the other people in conversations over the objects. The other image here, of course, is one of the things that I was very lucky to be able to pull up and look at with my students in the Fisher Library, and that is Margaret Atwood's her draft materials for The Handmaid's Tale. This is a book that I and many, many others have been turning to increasingly, not coincidentally, since 2016 in particular, and not just because of the TV series and the sequel, but anyway, The Handmaid's Tale is a fascinating, not just a fascinating set of archival materials to look at and to see how Margaret Atwood crafted this, again, iteratively, draft by draft, typescript by typescript, with others participating in that process, but also where the craft of writing is where we get a glimpse into that work by looking at those materials. The Handmaid's Tale is also fascinating, again, on the metaphorical side, in that it like all great works of literature, it it provides an imaginative scaffolding for dealing with the world in many cases. Another that goes alongside it that some may know, if Yuri Cowan is here, this one is for you, Yuri. That's Walter Miller's Canticle for Leibowitz. As it says here, the description on one of the paperback editions: by the time of the 32nd century, the atomic flame deluge was over, the earth was dead, all knowledge was gone. In a hellish, barren desert, a humble monk unearths a fragile link to 20th century civilization, a handwritten document from the blessed Saint Leibowitz that read, "Pound pastrami, can kraut, 6 bagels, bring home for Emma." Anyway, this is a book dealing with a kind of post-apocalyptic survival of a manuscript, of bookish objects, but also of knowledge and communities that go alongside them. Again, Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale does that in a different kind of way. Especially, apologies if I'm spoiling the end of the Handmaid's Tale, but I think the statute of limitations is up. But at the end of that novel, of course, we learn that the Handmaid's Tale is a record that has survived over time. It has survived the Gilead regime and is being discussed by historians in the future. And anyway, of course, for me, the most important part of that novel are the final 2 words, "Any questions?" Anyway, these two works of literature are the kind of thing I was thinking about increasingly during the pandemic when thinking about digital materials, because of course these deal imaginatively with the futurity of material things and the futurity of things created in the present, like Leibowitz's grocery list, but which may have a future ahead of them that is difficult to imagine, and yet for those of us who work in this field, necessary to imagine if we are to serve the people who aren't yet, who we don't know yet, and we may never know. It's the multi-generational nature of archiving and librarianship. Anyway, I wanted to contrast that with a quotation from Mortimer Adler from the past, from 1940. This is a quotation that deals with book modification. As he says here, when you buy a book in 1940, you establish a property right in it, just as you do in clothes or furniture when you buy and pay for them. But the act of purchase is actually only the prelude to possession in the case of a book. Full ownership of a book only comes when you have made it a part of yourself. And the best way to make yourself a part of it, which comes to the same thing, is by writing in it. Reading a book should be a conversation between you and the author. Anyway, that's Mortimer Adler writing in 1940 in How to Read a Book, a very influential book. I think we would expand his final point probably in the present, that reading a book is a conversation between you and the author. It's a conversation very often with other people, and that you don't just need social media to do that. But it's also, an annotated book is also a conversation between your past and future selves. An example of that is, of course, Marshall McLuhan's annotations on his own books. His library is now at the Fisher Library. And I did I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I did spend a little bit of work, I did a bit of work recently on his annotations of, I selected James Joyce's Ulysses rather than Finnegan's Wake, which I know is the more McLuhan-esque book to go to, but I had other reasons for choosing Ulysses, which I've written about. But here is McLuhan doing what Adler is saying we should do with books. He's making it our own, but having a conversation, not just stamping our name on it as a mark of ownership. So I was imagining, okay, what would a digital annotator of a book, someone who was as deliberate and careful as McLuhan, what are the affordances of digital platforms for doing that? What are the affordances? What are the constraints? So here's a comparison, a bit of an experiment I did in an article that came out not long ago in Textual Practice, which is linked from my blog, looking at the kinds of bibliographical evidence that might be left behind by a reader annotating as carefully as McLuhan, but using some of the contemporary e-reading platforms, including Microsoft Preview, fairly straightforward looking piece of software that's part of everyone's Apple operating system, but one that has some very interesting annotation affordances. Anyway, I was imagining the futurity of digital annotations and still am, but of course, this raises the question of comparison between the book that Mortimer is imagining and the books that McLuhan knew and modified, and what we experience in the present. So to contrast with Adler, I'd like to put beside his his quotation, something from Simone Murray's very recent book, An Introduction to Contemporary Print Culture Books as Media, an excellent book for as an invitation into print culture studies, and not just print as well. Books as media is an important subtitle. As Simone Murray says in a question she provides at the end of one chapter, an ebook comprises a stratified bundle of rights, the author's intellectual property, the executable programming code, the ebook file, and the reading device. Whereas readers of codex books own their copy and can gift or resell it, ebook readers only license content from ebook retailers who can and have unilaterally deleted downloaded ebook files, along with all the annotation readers had made in them. And Simone Murray asks, how do such issues complicate print culture theorists' traditional text-object distinction when conceptualizing a book? This is the kind of question that I work through with my classes and in my own research. One answer to that question, or at least something to put on the table next to that question, I noticed just walking home yesterday, it was in fact, after talking with David. Actually, sorry, I'll jump ahead. I'll come to that object in a moment. Another artifact, though, that I think speaks to Simone Murray's question is this XKCD cartoon. It's an example of how sometimes answers to good bibliographical questions can be found in unusual places. This is XKCD is a webcomic, which you can find. Anyway, if you click on this and start exploring, you'll probably spend a lot of time there because it's a fascinating webcomic. But here is Randall Munroe, the authors, creators of this comic, thinking about ebooks through a comic strip. So two characters under a tree. One of them says, "Whoa, what's this? The tree has a USB port. Try connecting to it. It's offering up a drive with one file on it embedded in the tree." And the file, as it turns out, is an ebook. It's Shel_Silverstein_ so on, The Giving Tree. And they say, "Oh, we've never heard of it. Okay, let's take a look." They try to open it, but there is a DRM error, a digital rights management error, which says you have not purchased the rights to view this file. Lending is not enabled. And so they walk off and give up. And if you know Shel Silverstein's The Giving Tree, you can sense the subtext here. The thing that I find most interesting about, well, one of the things I find very interesting about this cartoon is how specific Randall Munroe is being and how subtle he is in the file name itself. There's a kind of format literacy that he is presuming on the part of his readers, or perhaps encouraging, where it's not just Shel Silverstein's Giving Tree as an ebook, it's specifically a .azw file. Those of you who know ebook formats may recognize AZW as the proprietary ebook format of Amazon. So this cartoon does not mention Amazon by name, and yet Amazon is very much present through that AZW. So it's not just that they're running into, it's not just a hand-waving comment about ebooks as such, it is specifically about proprietary formats such as Amazon's and the role of DRM in the reading experience. There's more that I could unpack here, and I'm going to move on from this slide. But this moment, that instinct to share an object, again, that text object relationship or distinction, as Simone Murray mentions, that is something that you can experience not just by looking at the cartoon, but also by actually downloading this ebook. In fact, as part of my work on the book that I'm working on right now and hoping to finish soon, I, of course, followed up on the cartoon and noticed that Randall Munroe is not kidding. He's not making this up. If you are able to actually get your hands on the file as an AZW file, here I've renamed it. Well, if you then try to open that file purchased from Amazon, as I did here, in software such as Calibre, a popular ebook editor, well, you can see the cover of the book. So far, so good. If you try to open it, however, you get an almost identical message to what happens in the cartoon. This book is locked by DRM. To learn more about DRM and why you cannot read or convert this book, there you go. Anyway, this is also something that goes alongside. This is the object I was thinking ahead to. I just took a picture of this on the way home yesterday, walking through Toronto's Annex neighborhood, where somebody named Sophie had put up a poster saying that they're doing a community project. Their goal is to get 75 books to donate to the Children's Book Bank, a charity here in Toronto, and says, if you have any lightly used children's books, it would be great to drop them off on their porch. I redacted Sophie's address because I don't know if they want their home address broadcast over the web. But anyway, the Children's Book Bank, however, is a charity well worth checking out. It's based on that simple premise of bookishness, that these are objects to be shared, that they travel through the world, not just from one destination to the other, not just from purchaser to owner or licensor or licensee, but through the hands of children. And Children's Book Bank is a charity I especially like to support because it focuses on literacy as something that can help combat poverty, especially child poverty. So anyway, I just saw this yesterday and thought of that XKCD cartoon, but also Simone Murray's excellent question there. So some closing points here is that when we're thinking about the future of digital objects, it's also important to think of them as objects that live in the digital world. And one of the things about teaching book history during the pandemic that I found most interesting was that when it came to teaching about physical books, of course, that the inadequacy of many digital surrogates, or at least the non-equivalence of the surrogate, was very much present. All those things that we're familiar with, those very old debates in the history of the book about digital books versus real books, or real books as some people in that debate characterize them. They're both real. But what I was especially interested in are the things that actually live digitally. And an XKCD cartoon is an example of one of those things. So here I'm going to share a different screen briefly. I'm going to step out of PowerPoint. And you can do this at home too if you have if you want to enter this into your web browser, although I'll probably lose a large portion of the audience to XKCD. If you go to xkcd.com/956, you'll get to where this cartoon lives. If we were going to preserve this XKCD cartoon for the future, like St. Leibowitz's grocery list in the Canticle for Leibowitz, you might think that you could simply print it off, or a screenshot would do it. However, this is a born digital object. It lives, or a first generation digital object, as Matt Kirschenbaum has also called them. It lives, it's made to be experienced in a web browser. And the way that you can see that is through maybe not quite a bibliographical disruption, but certainly something fun that Randall Munroe builds into his. Notice that I just put my mouse cursor over the cartoon in my web browser, and you may be able to see that it says, in the new edition of the Giving Tree, the tree uses social tools to share with its friends all the best places to buy things. And this is a property of all of the XKCD cartoons, where there is an extra little comment that is encoded using one of the features of HTML, which you have to pass your mouse over in order to see. And that's something that will not work in a PowerPoint slide. So the field of web archiving is something, and internet history are fields that are very connected to book history and textual studies. I think could even be more connected, and an imperative in our world now. To do digital preservation of something like XKCD is one thing, and important and challenging enough. Some of you may have read in the news recently that there is a project that has come together recently with partners at Stanford and other universities in the world to help try and save Ukrainian digital heritage and to try to preserve that. Of course, saving lives is even more important, but saving culture, preserving the materials of a culture is important as well. We know that not just from what's happening in Ukraine, but many, many other things. Libricide exists as a term for a reason. Memoricide exists as a term for a reason. Anyway, this is a project that if you're interested in web archiving, but if you're also interested in bibliographical modes of thought and the way it can address themselves to the world, this is a fascinating project to check out and to support. I'm going to come back for my final points into PowerPoint here at the end of my time, but I wanted to suggest that what's missing actually in this cartoon, what we don't see in the XKCD cartoon, is the role of institutions. We don't see libraries, we don't see archives. In fact, what we're not even seeing are communities of practice of people who put advice up on the web on how to deal with unusual digital files and things like that. Video game preservation very much depends on those communities of practice of amateurs, often working at a near professional or actually professional level, pro-am digital preservation, as it's sometimes called. We're not seeing that present in here. And so that's why this cartoon is actually in some ways not representative as much as we might initially think that it is. It makes many good points, but there are things missing here that the real world of bibliography, to echo Ursula Franklin perhaps, does have present. And anyway, I would just close by saying, perhaps in the spirit of that little tree that we saw in Lawrence Hyde's illustration from Macbeth, that bibliographers, I would say, are the people who don't give up in the final two panels. Bibliographers are the people who'd still be under that tree trying to figure out, okay, how do we deal with something like DRM? Ideally doing it not just with one person, but many. I won't use the term resilience to describe that quality. Persistence, perhaps. But anyway, like the BHPC program itself, after 20 plus years, bibliography and book history and libraries can say that we are still here. So on that note, I'll leave you with this image of probably the last remaining tree from Burnham Wood in Scotland, which, as far as I know, is still standing in Scotland today with a little help. And I'll end by thanking you for coming, and thank you to the others who made this talk possible, and to my BHPC colleagues and students, past and present. Happy belated anniversary. Thank you.